the 15 current parks and some new ones that we're working on in the history of those parks, history of over time, beginning with indigenous history. I did say tonight we are attempting to videocast from Groveland Oaks County Park. And I just want to remind you what an incredible park Groveland Oaks. It's one of our two camping grounds. So I'm going to invite you. The park is closed now for the season, but I'm going to invite you next summer to come out and camp at our park. If you have a camper, bring it on out or a tent. If you don't, we have cabins here. And notice those round yurts there, those are rentable too. So it's a great place to camp. A lot of our campers are Oakland County people who come back year after year. So think about it. I live just down the road in Ortonville, and if you come camp here, let me know and I'll come visit you. All right, now tonight, one of the things I've been trying to think about with Oakland County as history is how we can take big themes of history like the Civil War and look for our own Oakland County connections. So tonight, I want to talk about the Civil War by looking at the people who left to fight in the Civil War, but also those people who got left behind, the wives and the children and the moms and the dads. And with that in mind, trying to find connections to the Civil War and to our park system. Let's think for a minute, though. Oakland County, we were far from the war front. So some people think, well, what kind of connections did we have? Well, we looked in 2016 when we were celebrating the sesquicentennial of the Civil War, we set out to try and find connections. And the way we did that, we had someone visit every one of our local historical societies and ask them to share their stories, whether they had a letter or they knew a little fact about their folks in the Civil War, or they had a cemetery with Civil War soldiers. And we created this incredible map. It's a big wall map. And too big for most people to hang, but I have a high resolution PDF of it. And I'm happy to send you. Anna will put in my email at the end and can share this with you. So let's start out with thinking about that map, and I'm going to take you to Southfield Oaks. This is a new map, sorry, a new park we're working on. And it's really a section of the old golf course at Beach Woods Park, which is a Southfield Township park. But I found an interesting story there. So I'm going to show you a Civil War prison. And my first story has to do with a Civil War prison. You may recognize this place. Let me show you what it looks like currently. That's Fort Mackinac on Mackinac Island. And most people don't realize at one time it was a Civil War prison. How did that happen? Well, step one, at the outbreak of the Civil War, the soldiers that were at Fort Mackinac were moved south to support the Union effort. And the island post was abandoned except for a single caretaker soldier, Sergeant William Marshall. He was the only one left behind. But that would change for him because during the summer of 1862, the fort did serve as a prison, but for just three prisoners. One of them was, I got to get something out of the way here. One of them was Washington Barrow, who'd been a member of the Confederate Senate. One was Josephus Guild, a politician, radical politician who favored armed resistance against the Union. And one was William Harding, a plantation owner and a strong advocate of the Confederacy. Now, what had happened? By 1862, the Union had regained control of Tennessee. And so a military governor was put in charge of Tennessee. Andrew Johnson. Now, you might remember from your history, Andrew Johnson would become vice president under Lincoln, and then he would become our 17th president. But at his career at this point, he was military governor of Tennessee. And what he did to try and establish his position was to arrest some Confederate sympathizers, including the three people who I just talked about. And then those three were sent to Fort Mackinac, which had been turned into a prison. Well, you need prison guards. And in April of 1862, Governor Grover Warner of Detroit was given the charge of creating a company of 100 soldiers to be the guards at Mackinac Island, thinking at that time there might be more than three prisoners over time. He formed what he called a company called the Stanton Guards, named for Edwin Stanton, at that time the Secretary of War. And then he and the Stanton Guards were sent to Mackinac Island to guard the prisoners. So you see here what the Civil War prison looked like in 1862. Well, now in September of 1862, Josephus Guild and William Harding swore allegiance to the Union, and they were released. But Washington Barrow held out, and he refused to do that. Well, now they had just one prisoner at Fort Mackinac. That didn't seem to make sense, especially so far north. So Washington Barrow was actually sent to Johnson's Island. Now, where was Johnson's Island? Another Michigan connection. Here's Johnson's Island. It's in Lake Erie. Here's Sandusky, Ohio, and right over here is Cedar Point. You can actually see Johnson's Island from Cedar Point from the top of some of those rides. A lot of people don't know that Johnson's Island had also been a Civil War prison with many more soldiers. And then, of course, there were no prisoners left on the island, and that company was dismissed and sent, and most of them entered other units during the Civil War, and that left the fort still there abandoned, except for one person. Poor Sergeant William Marshall, who would remain for some time as the sole soldier again at the fort. He would actually remain on the island until 1884 when he died on the island. He's actually buried there in one of the small cemeteries on Mackinac Island. He literally had been there since 1848 until 1884. But now, wait a minute. I said it had something to do with Southfield Oaks and Beechwoods Park. What is that connection? Well, let's look at the map again. And then if we look up here, right up here, and way down in the corner where Southfield is, here's what the Southfield Historical Society told us. Brothers Hamlin and William Delling served with the Stanton Guards and were tasked with guarding those Confederate officers at Mackinac Island. So it turns out that we had two Oakland County soldiers who served in the Stanton Guards. And if we look at the list of the Stanton Guards, you'll see them right here. Two brothers and were enlisted in Southfield, and that was home. Well, now let me show you something even more interesting. Here is a current map showing the boundaries of Beech Woods Park, and of course, Southfield Oaks is within there. Let me take you back in time. Here's 1857, and here is the outline of our park embedded on that 1857 map. And the whole northern part of our park happened to be the farm of John W. Delling, who just happened to be the father of Hamlin and William Delling. So those two had grown up on land that now has become our park. So we have a clear connection to the Stanton Guards and that fort on Mackinac Island. So that's how we take a look at connections. I take a look at who lived there at one time, what's their history, and then I begin to make those connections to a park. Now, big idea though. You know, it's bigger than Oakland County. It's bigger than the Stanton Guards. A big idea that is a pattern across Oakland County, across Michigan, in the country in general, is that family members often enlisted and served together. Just like the Delling brothers did, they basically enlisted on the same day. We see father and son, cousin and cousin, brother and brother, who will enlist and serve together. Now let me take you up here, far into the northwest corner of Oakland County, and something I found interesting. And it has to do with Hollyoaks. that's our ORV park. And the little blurb said, local townsfolk and farmers fed an historic meal to 1,000 Civil War soldiers who had arrived to catch a train from Holly to Detroit. That got me intrigued. Some questions. Well, who were they? All right. Who were these 1,000 soldiers and where did they come from? And how big a deal was it? Feeding 1,000 soldiers, was that a really big, hard thing to do? So I began to do some research into who are they initially. Well, I had a clue. 1,000 soldiers would have been a regiment. All right, a regiment was made up of companies. Companies had 100 soldiers, but a regiment had 1,000 soldiers. So I said that was a regiment that came to Holly. Well, then I happened upon the history of the 10th Regiment. This was the 10th Michigan Infantry, and someone had written a wonderful history of that regiment, which included a little blurb that said, at 2 o'clock, the right wing had reached Holly and were marched to tables loaded with luxuries provided by the people of Holly and vicinity. The roads were muddy, but we did not mind that. As soon as the right wing had eaten, the left were ready to take their place. A steady fire was kept up, but we were unable to conquer those invincible tables. Somebody had fed this whole 1,000 soldiers. Well, now I knew who they were. They were the 10th Regiment, but I needed to do more history. And then I found where they'd come from. They clearly had reached Holly, so they hadn't come from the Holly area. It turned out that they had come from Flint. The 10th Regiment had rendezvoused and been formed in Flint, Michigan. And they had to get to Holly where they could catch a train to Detroit, where they were then moved further south. At that time, there was no train between Flint and Holly. So how had they gotten there? For the most part, they had walked. The entire regiment had walked. A few had been loaned wagons by farmers, but the majority of them walked that muddy, wet day from Flint to Holly. Now, I was curious, how big a deal was that? Well, I needed to know how many people were living in Holly at the time. What was the population of Holly? And we're lucky because online are a series of books called the Michigan State Gazetteer and Business Directory. And for each town in Michigan, there's a little description of the town, some of the businesses, the population, and it had said that at the time, Holly had only 700 inhabitants, and that included some of the people living outside the village. Think about that. We have 700 people who have to feed 1,000 people. Just imagine a town today of 20,000 people who were serving 30,000 people. That was a huge, big deal. And keep in mind, of this 700, a lot of them would have been children. So it was a hugely, hugely big deal at that time. I kind of wonder where they even got all the tables because they were serving at least 500 of them at one time. We don't have any more details than that, but it's a reminder of that connection between Oakland County and, in this case, our little ORV park. Big idea, however, beyond that, local communities supported the war effort. Newspapers are filled with examples. Here's Farmington. The people of Farmington had collected $250 worth of clothing and bedding from Michigan soldiers. That's the equivalent today of $8,000 worth of clothing and bedding. Here we have the ladies of Birmingham, and they had donated towels and handkerchiefs and housewives. Wait, that caught my attention. I can understand collecting towels and handkerchiefs for soldiers, but they were also sending them housewives? Well, here's one thing we need to remember. Language changes over time. I figured out that a housewife meant something different, and sure enough, it did. This was a housewife. It was a sewing kit. that the women put together so that there were buttons in there and a thimble and a needle so that a soldier was able to darn and mend his own clothes. So once again, the idea here, from Holly's example, we now can look at other local communities in Oakland County. What were some other ways they supported the war effort? And now I'm going to take you to Pontiac Oaks. Officially, that's our newest park. Some of you may know it as Hawthorne Park. We're doing magic there. New docks and new pathways and new trails. It's going to be a wonderful park we're continuing to work on. But now what I want to do is take you in terms of Pontiac to a cemetery, Oak Hill Cemetery. Some of us and some of the folks in the audience tonight have been doing work in Oak Hill. I want to show you, this is the Stevens family lot at Oak Hill. This is Samuel and Rebecca, the parents of the Stevens family, and on the back is one of their sons, John Stevens. John Stevens was born in 1842 and he died in 1863. John Stevens was a member of Company G of the 54th Massachusetts Volunteer Infantry. He had gone from Pontiac to Massachusetts to enlist in the 54th. The 54th was the first Black regiment raised in the United States. Why did he go so far? Why didn't he enlist in Michigan? Because at that time, Michigan had not raised a Black regiment. You know, there were a lot of people who said, we're not so sure African Americans can fight. Well, you'll see how Black regiments proved them wrong. But John Stevens did not want to wait until it happened in Michigan. And so he and some others from our area went all the way to Massachusetts and enlisted. This was a very famous regiment. Some of you may know this regiment because you saw the movie Glory, which was the story, the history of this particular regiment. You know, when I saw this movie when it came out, I was fascinated by the story it told. And I didn't know at the time. Somebody from my hometown had served in that regiment. It would take me some time to find that out. Now you'll notice the other part of the writing on his grave, that he fell in battle at the Battle of Fort Wagner in South Carolina. John Stevens was one of those soldiers who was killed during that battle. So he is not buried in Oak Hill. His family wanted him remembered, so they put that on the back of the family gravestone. He's actually buried here on Morris Island in a mass grave that held many of the soldiers who were killed during that battle, from the soldiers from the 54th. And so it's important to remember here, we have a soldier, African-American soldier, a Pontiac person who was connected to that Black regiment. We take you to another place in Oak Hill Cemetery, right here. That's this is a grave of someone who is buried there and who was an African American soldier. Now, he doesn't have, oh, sorry. This is John Anderson, who you can see we think he was born about 1815. There's disputes and records, and you'll see why in a minute. And then he lived till 1893. Now, he does not have the typical Civil War gravestone that so many soldiers have. He has no gravestone, but I was interested in his story. In 1893, when he died, there were a couple death notices, and the one I found said, quote, in early life, he was a slave in Missouri. He escaped via the Underground Railway to Canada. Wow, I said. I'd been looking for freedom seekers who were buried in Oak Hill, who had made their way utilizing the Underground Railroad, made their way to Pontiac. That's been research for several years now. And I had located John Anderson. Well, now it seemed that he, utilizing the Underground Railroad, had made it from Missouri to Canada. But there was more to his story. In 1884, he'd been featured in a Pontiac Gazette, and there he had told a little more of his story almost 10 years earlier. I was a slave for 36 years in Missouri, Arkansas, and Louisiana. Whoa, there was more to his story. He'd been enslaved here, but then in what they called being sold south, sold to Arkansas, and then to Louisiana. What was happening? Cotton industry was growing in the South, and it needed more and more enslaved people. So people were selling human beings southward to be part of that cotton plantation industry. And then we know, according to what he said, from Louisiana, he had made his way utilizing Underground Railroad into Canada. But then there was more. I had found his enlistment record that said on January 4th, 1864, he'd enlisted at Pontiac in the First Color Regiment of Michigan. This was the Michigan First. And that meant from Canada, he had come back into the United States in order to enlist in the Civil War. Now, what about that 1st Michigan Colored Infantry? That had been organized at Detroit starting in August of 1863 through February of 1864. We had finally decided to raise a Black regiment. Volunteers were from Michigan, but also from Canada. Several of them who had been enslaved in the South, become freedom seekers, made their way to Canada, then come back and said, we are going to fight in the Union Army and finally defeat slavery. Look at all the soldiers. These are all Oakland County soldiers who served in the Michigan First. Now, this regiment trained at Camp Ward in Detroit. It was a miserable place. According to the Detroit Advertiser, which was a very strong anti-slavery newspaper, it was the only newspaper who decided to talk about how awful Camp Ward was. In their quote, there's not a barn or a pigsty in the whole city of Detroit that is not more fit for human habitation than the quarters at Camp Ward. Clearly, if you compared this camp to another camp with white regiments, there was quite a difference. Now, by May of 1864, the designation of the Michigan Fourth was changed to the 102nd United States Colored Troops. You'll see it listed as the 102nd USCT. And of course, Black regiments had all white officers because they said, well, Black soldiers, okay, but not Black officers. The leader of the 102nd for some time was an Oakland County person, Colonel Newcomb Clark of Oxford. So he actually led that regiment for some time. Now, 180,000 Black soldiers served in the Union Army. 40,000 of them died. Now, here's an interesting fact. Those soldiers made up 10% of the Union Army, but 40% of the Union dead or missing. Now, a little more about John Anderson and the importance of locating soldier service records. You'll notice here, he was paid $7 per month. Black soldiers were actually paid $10 a month, but before they were paid, they deducted $3 to pay for the uniform they were wearing. They actually had to essentially pay $3 a month. Think about that. That's a third of what they were paid in order to pay for the uniform they were wearing. White soldiers were paid $13 a month, and they were not charged a uniform fee. Down here, you'll notice that this particular month they deducted $1.75 because he was given a knapsack. So Black soldiers actually had to pay for their equipment also. Here you'll see that by September 30th, 1865, the 102nd was actually mustered out of service. And what happened? He came home. He came home, according to records, he came home to Pontiac. By 1872, he was living here with his wife, Sarah, on Jackson Street in Pontiac. Now, here's an interesting thing. Take a look at all these families marked in purple. I've been researching all of them. My records indicate all of them had formerly been enslaved and became freedom seekers and ended up in Pontiac. Now, the 1880 census shows John and Sarah still alive, living still on Jackson Street. But notice he was almost 20 years older than Sarah was. He's listed as a laborer, still working at age 67 and having rheumatism, a common ailment about veterans of the Civil War. Now, when were they married? Did they have any children? I've been so far hitting brick walls in terms of that. I'm still having struggles finding out more about John and Sarah. What I do know is that John Anderson died on December 7th, 1893. Cause of death was listed as cancer of the mouth. He was listed as simply as a laborer born in Missouri. The Oakland County Post, in listing his death notice, said simply, Corporal John Anderson, 80, Pontiac, ex-slave, and war veteran. You can see that he enlisted as a private and became a corporal at the end of 1864. On December 19th, 1893, just about a week after he died, Sarah Anderson bought two grave lots in Block 1 of Oak Hill Cemetery. She paid $5 for each of them, equivalent of $10. And then John Anderson was buried here. Likely, Sarah didn't have the money for a gravestone. So he is buried, keep in mind, a corporal Civil War soldier without a gravestone. Now, what about Sarah? Sarah died in 1911. Now, there was some information on her death notice that intrigues me. She was listed as being born in 1830 in Clarksburg, Kentucky. Her father was listed as Benjamin Goodin and her mother unknown. Here's my theory. My guess is that, like her husband, Sarah Anderson had been a freedom seeker, had been formerly enslaved. My guess is Benjamin Goodin was not only her father, but likely her enslaver, since her mother was listed as unknown or unlisted. Now, who would gave this information? One thing you want to think about for a death certificate, it'll have the informer down in here. That will say who knew this family information. Now, this is a mystery because that informer happens to be O.C. Farmer, who was the undertaker in Pontiac at the time for many of the deaths at Oak Hill. Now, this tells me something. I don't think Mr. Farmer knew these facts. Somebody in 1911 knew something about Sarah Anderson. Was it a child of theirs that I haven't found yet? Was it someone who was close to her? But this is a clue that somebody knew more, and I simply have to find who that person was. Where was Sarah buried? Right next to her husband, John Anderson, again in an unmarked grave. Big idea. African American soldiers played a critical and often forgotten role in the Civil War. Now I want to take you to Independence, Oaks. By the way, if you haven't been out to Independence this October, if you want to see beautiful color, visit Independence, Oaks. Here on the map again, I want to show you how many cemeteries we listed on the map. These are cemeteries who have at least one Civil War soldier, and some of them have many. We miss some because it seems that almost every Oakland County cemetery, particularly the historic ones, have one or more Civil War soldiers. So this particular cemetery, Seymour Lake, just to the north of Independence, has the grave of Eldad Smith. Now, again, a clue that not all the cemeteries were included on the map. But I was curious to see who Eldad Smith was. Now, here's Independence Oaks County Park. Right here is the line between Independence and Brandon Township. So Independence, our park is right on the border there. Well, it turned out that Eldad Smith was born in the township I live in, Brandon, just over from our park, just north of our park. I learned that in 1856, he married Esther Ann Hoyt. Well, I had to find out who Esther was. Well, Esther had grown up right here, just down the road, about a mile and a quarter from where he was living. Remember, no eHarmony, no Match.com. You married a girl on a farm nearby. Now, who was Esther? Well, Esther was the son of the Joseph Hoyt, who was the local blacksmith in that area. By 1860, they showed up in the 1860 census. It was Eldad and Esther and 3-year-old Jesse Smith. 1861, the Civil War break out, and Esther and Eldad will be hugely impacted by the war. Beginning with Samuel Hoyt, who was Esther's brother. He enlisted in the 14th Infantry in March of 1862. He was killed by a gunshot wound in January of 1863, not even a year after he'd enlisted. He's buried in Nashville National Cemetery. And then her younger brother, Charles Hoyt, 17, enlisted in August of 1864 in the 4th Michigan Infantry. Now, he was listed as 17. He had to be 18. He's a reminder that a lot of young guys who were less than 18, remember, no birth certificates, you kind of said, we know now he was 17, but he was too young officially to enlist. He died of disease, diarrhea. You won't believe how many Civil War soldiers died of something like diarrhea. And he died and was buried in Huntsville, Alabama. And then what about her husband? Eldad enlisted in the same regiment and company as her brother. He enlisted in September of 1864, but just before he left, he bought a little piece of land. We have a deed to that land. He bought 40 acres, and it was located right down here, literally across the street from her parents. If you go into Independence Oaks County Park, that's where our maintenance building and office is today. That was the farm of the Eldad family. But then I found that Eldad had been hospitalized in Nashville for measles and blood poisoning. Remember, this was the hospital where his brother-in-law had died. But he survived. He came home, came back to his family and that little farm of 40 acres in Independence Township. But then, less than 6 months after he got home, he died of blood poisoning. Of course, where had he contracted that? During the Civil War. He's a reminder that when we look at the number of deaths during the Civil War, it's actually much higher because we have a huge number of people who came home and died within a year. Their cause of death was still the Civil War, but they're not recorded because they've already mustered out of the army. Of course, that left Esther a widow. 3 sons, ages 8 and 5 and 3. But on top of that, I learned that Esther was also 5 months pregnant. Imagine what it would have been to be a widow, because he had come home. He had been there with them, and then he passes away. What is Esther going to do? Well, like many Civil War widows, she's going to marry. She married a person named William Griggs in August of 1869. Now, I always want to know when a Civil War widow marries, who the person was. I'm always curious because usually it's someone they know. Sometimes they went to school with them or there's somebody nearby. I had trouble. I could not find out anything about William Griggs. He was kind of a mystery person. But I could see by 1870, they were living on the farm that Esther had inherited upon the death of her husband. Here was William and Esther. Here were her three sons. Oh, and then little Elta, a daughter, age 3. This was the child that Esther had been pregnant with when Eldad Smith passed away. I did notice it was unusual because often, in this case, the children would have taken William's last name. They would have been adopted. And even if not officially adopted, usually you find they've given the name to the children. So that made me a bit uneasy. But then 1880, the census, it was only Esther and her son Jesse. Wow, I said, you know what's happened? She's a widow again. Now she's lost a second husband. But then, as history often does, it began to twist and turn. I was lucky enough to locate a pension record. Esther had applied for a widow's pension, which it occurred to me, well, that would have been after the death of her second husband, but it turned out to be quite different. Because within the pension record, by the way, are treasure troves of family history. They're very, very detailed. This one I was able to locate in the National Archives in Washington, doing some research there. And what Esther had said when she told her story to the pension office was that Mr. Griggs married me under an assumed name, and I was not aware of it for nearly 5 years. That was why I couldn't find him. He was using an assumed name. During all the time I lived with him, he was ugly to me and treated me very cruelly, threatening to strike me, once jamming the door against my hand so that it broke my finger. Being married to him, I suppose I must live with him and stand his abuse. But that changed for Esther. When I found that he had deceived me and married me under an assumed name, I immediately left him. So she had stayed with him like so many abused wives do, but then she found out he had deceived her and she finally left him. A court did dissolve her marriage on February 14th of 1884. Now I found she married a third time in 1892. She married William Cathro. He was much older than she was, almost 15 years. Now, who was William Cathro? I had to know. He was a blacksmith. Here's my theory. How does she know him? I'm thinking he was probably a friend or acquaintance of her father. Blacksmiths out here in northern Oakland County, they knew each other. These people, he was from Holly, and I'm sure that they knew each other at the time. I'm hoping she had a happy marriage at that time. You know, a census record or a marriage record doesn't tell you whether she was happy. But I did find them in 1900 in Grand Rapids, and they were living with his daughter and her husband. She will die, Esther, in 1903. And cause of death, creeping paralysis from physical exhaustion. You know, you have to believe that many times in Esther's life, she must have struggled with depression and sadness, likely leading to physical exhaustion. Now, William actually outlived her. He's buried in Grand Rapids. She's not in that cemetery. I'm convinced she's probably buried here. There are some occupied graves without names in Seymour Lake Cemetery. The records don't show her, but I'm convinced she's likely buried there next to her first husband, Eldad Smith, in Seymour Lake. Big idea. The Civil War created a great many widows. We don't even have a number to place on that. But think of the women who were left behind, and then the husband doesn't come home. And finally, I'm going to take you out to Groveland Oaks, where I happen to be tonight. Tiny little cemetery very close to Groveland called Mount Bethel. And you'll notice here this gravestone. What do you think? A flag and a cannon. This is an old gravestone. My guess was likely a Civil War soldier. It turned out to be the grave of T.S. Byrd Jr. Here are his parents' gravestone. The Byrd family out here in Groveland, Brandon, was quite a large family, had lots of farmland. Well, now it turned out that Thomas Byrd had enlisted in the 8th Michigan Cavalry now, first cavalry officer we've talked about tonight in Company I. But it also turned out that two of his brothers had enlisted in the same company. Imagine a family having three sons. At that time, there are only three sons enlist and they're gone. Now, if you look at their enlistment dates, Alicia, the youngest, will enlist on February 6th, and then Joseph on the 11th, and Thomas on the 12th. What's your guess here? The younger brother will enlist, and then the other two say, we're going to go with him. We can't let him go by himself. And they'll all enlist the same week in the same company. Well, in searching for the three of them, I found that Thomas Byrd, whose grave I was researching, it said he had died while on furlough from General Hospital Number 1 in Annapolis, Maryland. So it turned out he was in the hospital, and then often they're furloughed to go home if they're ill to recover. And it seemed like that had happened to him, but he had died while on furlough. Well, then it turned out I found an important record. This was a widow's pension application. It turned out that young Thomas Byrd had been married to a woman named Delora. She had actually applied for a widow's pension. Now, notice when you find a pension card like this, there's two important numbers to look for. This is the application number. This means she applied. But when you see a certificate number, it means the pension was approved. And then you know there's a paper trail. You might have to go to Washington, or if you're lucky, like I was, Fold 3 has some widow pension files online now. Fold 3 is a subscription service. If you have Ancestry, you can get a discount on Fold 3. A lot of libraries who have an Ancestry account sometimes pay for Fold 3, or you can know somebody like me who will look something up for you on Fold 3. There was a 46-page pension record for Thomas Byrd that was loaded with critical information. For example, there was the record of Delora's claim for a pension, and it turned out, notice it's a pension for widow and children. When he died, he left behind two children, Charles, who was 2 years, and Sarah, who was only 7 months. So once again, we have this young widow with children. And then the really magic to this file and the storyteller here was a letter written by his father. His father had written an affidavit explaining something about the death of his son and what had happened, and testifying that indeed Delora was his widow. And in the letter, he said, my son was taken prisoner in the summer of 1864, and he was sent to Andersonville at that time. Now, Andersonville was often considered a death sentence for a soldier, and families often thought about that. But Thomas Byrd, in December of 1860, was paroled in a prisoner exchange. And then, because he was so ill, he was sent to Annapolis Hospital. Remember, we found a record that had said that. And then, one day after Christmas in 1864, his father decided to go to Annapolis and bring his son home. This was the first Civil War soldier I had found something like that. But again, he decided, he got to Annapolis, stayed, and then said on January 6th he was going to bring him home by train. And they set out. He describes how it was difficult. His son had to be carried into a hotel 2 different nights, but they made it to Toledo, Ohio, where sadly his son passed away in Toledo. And then on January 6, 1865. And then poor Thomas Bird Sr. then had to take the body of his son home to Groveland Township, where he was buried right here in Little Mount Bethel Cemetery. Now, we would have known none of that because that record originally was in the National Archives in a brown envelope until somebody decided that they needed to digitize some of those records and place them online. But the whole story was in that letter. Big idea, disease was but the major cause of death during the Civil War. Of the estimated 620,000 recorded deaths during the Civil War, 2/3 were the result of disease. Diarrhea, malaria, smallpox, chickenpox, measles, huge, huge numbers. But now what happened to Delora? I had to find out. 1880 Groveland census, here she was with her 2 children, Charles and Sarah. It turns out that Delora never remarried. All right. Why? I don't know. She had children, but this is an example of a Civil War widow who never did remarry. Notice her occupation was listed as farmer. She was running the farm that she had inherited upon the death of her husband. Now, sadly, she died just 4 years later, 4 years later of inflammation of the lungs, most likely, since it said that, consumption or tuberculosis. And of course, she's buried right next to her husband, Thomas S. Bird, in Little Mount Bethel. You can see my friends like Katie Neal, who are working with me so hard to get some of these gravestones repaired. Here's an example of 2 that are in desperate need of repairs. But then I had to find out about those 2 other brothers. It turns out that Joseph Bird had been captured the very same day as his brother Thomas and sent to Andersonville. Imagine what that must have been like for Thomas and Sarah Bird, the parents, to realize that 2 of your sons had been imprisoned at Andersonville. Now, it turned out that Joseph made it home. He lived until 1901, and he's buried in Lakeview Cemetery in Clarkston. And then Elisha, he also made it home. He died in that, oh, let me come back here. He lived until 1916, and he's also buried in Lakeview Cemetery. Big idea here, large numbers of people were imprisoned during the war. Over 400,000 Union and Confederate soldiers were held prisoner at one time or another at more than 150 different prison sites. Approximately 56,000 of those soldiers died in prison, which takes us back to where we started, the Civil War prison on Mackinac Island. And of course, the realization that Oakland County, though far from the war front, has many, many connections to the Civil War. And then let's think about that for a minute. Um, as a historian, I view a civil war, whether it's our Civil War, Syria, any of the other, Somalia, the different wars. Currently, there are over 12 civil wars going on the planet. As a historian, I view a civil war as a failure of a country. I think it's a failure to solve your problems peacefully. I know it gets to that point, but I still view a civil war as a failure. And now that creates kind of a problem now because there are people who are telling us We only want to talk about America's successes. We don't want to talk about the failures. We only want to talk about the successes. The Smithsonian should only be about our successes. I think that's a huge problem because I am convinced, as a historian, we learn more from our failures than we do for our successes. And I think it's a huge problem to only talk about your successes and to push those failures under the carpet. So, what do we learn then from studying a failure? Well, some historians recently made a statement about what they think we need to have learned from our own Civil War. Quote, one thing we can learn, the devastating consequences of deep societal divisions. What happens when people cannot get along and they're divided? The consequences can be civil war, serious consequences. So, what does that teach us? The need for compromise and unity to preserve a nation, even when facing extreme polarization. In other words, we failed in the past. We were polarized before the Civil War. And we didn't compromise and we didn't try to unify. And we ended up in a civil war. Now, think about today, folks. I don't know about you, but I am seeing extreme polarization now. I think that's a message that we need to be thinking about. How are we going to compromise? How are we going to become unified again? So, big lessons to learn, lots of incredible stories. I could share another 12 tonight, but it's almost 8 o'clock. It's rainy out there, and my hotspot, bless its heart, has been very good to me tonight, and I know that's not going to last. Last thing, before we take a few questions or comments, the last 2025 Fireside Chat in honor of Native American Indigenous History Month. I will be talking about Indigenous connections to Oakland County parks. And I'll talk about waterways and trails and artifacts and wild rice and serviceberry and apple trees. I think you'll find it interesting.